Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Welcome to Quiet Riots with me, Naomi Smith. By day, I am, for listeners who don't know, CEO of Best for Britain. And by night, I am both a podcaster and a non-exec director of an incredible charity, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. And it's the latter that I'm going to be talking about with you today, because RoSPA, as we call them for short, have been doing some brilliant research about accidents and accident prevention. I know all of you love data almost as much as I do, so stick with me on this one, because the numbers are truly shocking. But in the spirit of Quiet Riot, there is also a very substantial call to action for the government. So did you know that accidents are the most common cause of preventable death among the under 40s in England? And the problem is worse in Scotland. Since 2013, UK accidental deaths have risen a whopping 50%. 2022 marked the first time in at least 20 years that UK accidental deaths exceeded 20,000 a year. That is, to give you some perspective, more than the capacity of London's O2 Arena. And in fact, over the last decade, more than 177,000 people have very sadly died in the UK due to accidents. And that's the equivalent of the population of an area like Rochdale. But it isn't just fatal accidents that are increasing. In England alone, accident-related hospital admissions have gone up 48% in the 2 decades to 2022, and over 740,000 people were admitted to hospital due to accidents in England alone in 2022, 2023. And that is about the same size as the city of Leeds. So it's having a devastating impact on far too many people and, of course, their families. But even if you or a loved one haven't suffered an accident, the sheer scale of preventable accident in the UK will be impacting your life indirectly. Why? Why, I hear you ask, Naomi. I haven't hurt myself. My family haven't. Why would it be impacting me? Well, because, and here's where the numbers get really big, preventable accidents are costing the UK, according to RoSPA work, £12 billion a year, and are leading to 29 million work days lost. So that is almost half a day for every single person in the UK, or 2/3 of a day for every working aged person in the UK. And so the strain this is putting on the NHS is immense. If you're waiting to be treated, it may well be because the people ahead of you in the queue are needing to be treated for a preventable accident. The sheer scale of that, the pressure that that is putting on bed space, on money, on time, on medics, resources, is time and resource that could be directed into treating other serious illness and much less preventable illness. And what is worse is that these accidents are often incredibly easily avoided. We all know the health service is on its knees. Reducing pressure on the NHS must be a priority. So it is my very great pleasure to be joined today by somebody that knows far more about this than I do, RoSPA's research manager, James Broun. Welcome, James.
Thanks very much, Naomi. And those figures really are shocking, aren't they?
They really are. Before we do get into them, and my goodness, I know you're going to tell us the stories behind all of that data and what it really means for us, but tell us a bit about your background. What brought you into RoSPA? What is it about data that gets you out of bed in the morning?
I've been at RoSPA for nearly a year now, and preparing for this report launch and this research that we've done has taken up the bulk of that time. It's been a big part of my job over the last year. It's been pulling together a lot of the data that lies behind this report. But prior to arriving at RoSPA in the early part of 2024, I worked at Make UK, which is a trade association for manufacturers, and they work across not just manufacturing, as you'd imagine, but also they engage with the government around all issues affecting businesses. And I actually also worked in a particular part of that related to housing and what we would call pre-manufactured housing. So that is modular homes that are built in factories and put up on the building site, already made. It's quite remarkable if you get a chance to see it.
Well, we'll have to record an entire show with you about the housing crisis and modular being part of the answer.
Absolutely, yeah. But what was really fascinating about that was that you realize how integral the homes are for safety and how essential it is that homes are not just built safe in terms of the materials that they use, but they're built safe as well in terms of being free of hazards for people. And you really realize the work that goes into that today. So that sort of is the bridge between what I'd previously done and where I am today. But my time at RoSPA has, as you say, involved an awful lot of number crunching. I think data is really powerful. It can tell a really powerful story as well. The challenge, of course, is trying to connect that data with people's lives, with the day to day, with experiences that we can all relate to and understand. And I think you've outlined really nicely in your introduction how that's possible and why these numbers, why it's really important that we gather these numbers in the first place, and why they can be hopefully used to put forward a case for change. That's what gets me up in the morning anyway.
Well, and hopefully also podcasting, because we're going to really get into it now. So this week, you've launched at RoSPA the National Accident Prevention Strategy. Can you just talk us through headline numbers and what it is you want the government to be doing about it?
You've outlined really well the headline statistics from our report. The number of people that have been killed as a result of accidents in the UK has been rising now for well over a decade. It's really quite staggering. It seems to be one of these statistics that's just not reported on. When we look at figures relating to public health that get reported on in the news, we tend to see statistics that relate to very horrible, serious illnesses like cancer. And if we were to see the kind of rise in people dying of cancer over the last 10 years that we've seen of accidents, I think we would quite rightly be shocked and it would be headline grabbing. But for some reason, these figures, like I say, 21,000 people killed in accidents in 2022, over 800,000 hospitalized across the whole of the UK. I mean, those are huge figures, right? To me, that's staggering. And as somebody that has come into this sector from outside of the world of health and safety, I find those figures incredible. I mean, when I was advocating for, like I say, issues in housing, we had a lot of big numbers, but the economic costs and the number of people killed and hospitalized in relation to accidental injuries is so large that frankly, I think it should be hard to ignore this problem. And yet, for some reason, the problem does seem to have gone under the radar. What we want to see government do is actually start to look at this holistically, because what's become apparent in the writing of this report is not just the enormity of the problem, but is the fact that there is not a joined up policy landscape that is trying to deal with this. Accident prevention is nobody's favorite topic in government, apparently. There are obviously lots of experts out there, and there are people in the medical profession and in organizations like RoSPA that really understand the scale and severity of these problems. But in government, there's always something else that seems to pip it to the post when it comes to funding, when it comes to a joined up policy landscape. And the result is, frankly, that something like accident prevention has just, I would say, fallen between the cracks. If you look at even just an area like housing or product safety, there are so many regulators, so many government departments that have stakes in this, that there's no one place where there's responsibility, and there's certainly no one direction being set. So the reason we're calling for a national accident prevention strategy from government is essentially that we want them to recognize the scale of this problem and to take the first steps to solving it. Let's think about it. If we were a business and as a country and we were facing a problem on the scale of this, we would have a plan. Pretty much every business will have some sort of business plan, usually over multiple years, because that's the way out of a problem like this. That's how you generate long-term growth or long-term change. Currently, we don't have that for accidents in the UK. I think the effects are clear. Like I say, we've seen rates going up, we've seen progress in a lot of areas at best stagnating, and we've seen no real policy innovations in this area for quite a long time now. And it's unsurprising then that we've seen the effects in society and the economy like you're seeing. But it isn't just about saving lives, because however important that is, there is an economic cost to this that you've outlined.
Well, this is it. I wanted to ask you, most campaigns, and certainly, campaigns that I've worked on over the years, housing in particular, have a money ask attached to them. Please build 300,000 new homes a year, of which 100,000 are social. That is not a cheap ask of government. Most campaigns, when they're lobbying government, they want them to spend money on something. There is a very clear cost implication attached to the accidents that are happening, particularly on the NHS, but also, of course, in lost business days for people going to work and the organisations that employ them. But here, it sounds to me like your ask is, please let us help you save money. That puts you in quite a different position from many groups, doesn't it?
It does. There are lots of areas in which accident prevention involves very little and sometimes no spending. It is often about trying to get messaging out to people. It is sometimes about conducting research. But like I say, at a very top level, what we're asking for right now is for government to simply set a direction, to set a strategy. And essentially, that doesn't have to cost very much at all. You're absolutely right that there are so many areas of policy making and problems that we face as a society, frankly, that would need to have significant investment into. I don't want to pretend that there aren't areas where we would like to see added investment in accident prevention in the long term, because it would help. And there are things which, if they were funded or properly funded, would certainly help to deliver results for us. But right now, the scale of the problem is so big that we're almost having to start from quite a foundational place. And so taking those initial steps, at least getting government to recognise the problem, see it as a joined up issue, seeing it as a preventable public health problem, and implementing at least a sort of the guiding steps first, and then gradually developing more specific policy interventions further down the line. That's what we want to see right now. And you're absolutely right. The potential savings for government are quite substantial. It's worth me flagging as well at this point that we have an aging population. And the sad reality is that older people are more likely to suffer serious accidents. And hopefully it might be obvious to some people why that is. But if not, the reason is that older people naturally are frailer. They have issues around bone density, issues around coordination, and they may have other health conditions as well, which if they fall or if they suffer an accident, mean that they tend to suffer from that more seriously than other people. But because we have an aging population, we're very much set to see the number of accidents amongst older people rise quite sharply over the coming decades. And that will all be a cost to the NHS and to public services, an enormous cost, actually. So we're at a level where we need to start taking action. And there is not just a case of preventing the costs that are being incurred today. There is essentially the business case here, I suppose, if we determine it that way, of implementing this to address rising change and to recognize that there's going to be a long-term additional cost to the NHS. And actually, to give you a sense of the scale of this, we're talking about, in addition to what you've already said at the beginning, Naomi, another 300,000 hospitalizations amongst the over 65s by the mid-2060s every year. That's an extra £2 billion in today's prices as a cost to the NHS. That's a huge, huge additional cost. If we don't start reversing this trend now, that's potentially very likely where we're going to end up in 30, 40 years' time. And whilst it's really easy to say, well, that's okay, we've got pressing issues today, let's kick the can down the road, that is a gradual trend. That's not going away. And if we think about what that means for future budgets and for future spending, it's frankly quite scary, I think.
The new Apple Watch Series 10 is here. It has the biggest display ever. It's also the thinnest Apple Watch ever, making it even more comfortable on your wrist. And it's the fastest charging Apple Watch, getting you 8 hours of charge in just 15 minutes. Introducing the all-new Apple Watch Series 10. Now available for the first time in glossy jet black aluminum. Compared to previous generation, iPhone XS or later required. Charge time and actual results will vary.
So is our aging population the single biggest factor explaining the really quite extraordinary rise we've seen in preventable accidents over the last couple of decades?
Not entirely, no. We've actually seen accidental death rates rise fastest in the middle-aged, believe it or not, over the
Why?
last decade.
Do we know
We're
why?
not entirely sure, to be honest. And this is again one of the other points that's come out of this, because people, particularly in government, haven't interrogated these figures. There's a lot of unknowns, but there are a number of types of accidental injury, things like accidental poisonings, which have risen quite sharply in that age cohort. But we are also seeing people who are older suffering from increased rates of accidental death and hospital admissions as well. And obviously, to be clear, the older people are more likely, ultimately out of everybody, to end up being seriously injured by accidents. But like I say, the trends are not as uniform as you'd imagine. And it's quite worrying in particular, actually, that we are seeing more working age people getting killed and seriously injured as a result of accidents over the last decade. That's something that is going to be having an effect on our economy, and it is potentially going to be causing drags in terms of productivity, lost working days, lost output, and economic growth ultimately.
And potentially welfare bill if they are then unable to return to work, and the knock-on effect of that.
Absolutely. And it's worth saying that, it's not just about that welfare bill, but it's about ultimately if somebody has had to stop working or substantially reduce their hours or their income, then that spending on the economy is reduced too. That's long-term lack of output on their part, but that is also then a cost in terms of wider spending and other indirect costs for their families and for other people across the economy. It's a very substantial knock-on effect.
And what about regional disparities, James? I mentioned Scotland at the top of the show. Where are things worse, and do we know why? Like, are there intersecting issues around health inequality that might be driving different accident rates across the country?
There is quite a diversity of accident rates around the UK, actually. Scotland has the worst of the four nations. And actually, if we break down England into regions as well, Scotland still is the worst overall in terms of accident rates. In Wales is also quite high, but actually, I think the worst outside of Scotland and Wales is the northwest of England,
And we're
followed
saying
by
worse on
the
a per
northeast.
capita basis, are we?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. This is a per capita basis. So it's in other words, if you're in Scotland, you're quite substantially more likely to be killed in an accident than if you are in England. And actually, out of everywhere, London has the lowest. So there's a bit of a thing here where we're starting to see a kind of capital versus provinces, sort of metropole versus provincial areas of England pulling apart from each other here. So there's a north-south divide. There's London with the lowest rates across the UK. There's a really wide variation. And that variation carries on at local authority level as well. So if we look at the 10 lowest accidental death rates by local authority in the UK, 9 of those are in Greater London. Whereas if we look at the highest accidental death rates, they are out of England and Wales. I don't have that data in Scotland, unfortunately, but they are in the northwest of England. They're in Wales. They're in the southwest of England. They are in more regional areas that are further away from our capital and have very different accident profiles. The reasons for that are again quite complicated. I wish I could give you a really simple narrative, but it's very clear from other evidence that there are significant existing health inequalities between the regional parts of England and the capital, for instance. And ultimately, a lot of that comes back down to underlying economic deprivation. It comes down to things like public services. It comes down to the age profile of areas. It's a really complicated mix of factors. But ultimately, what it means is that people in these areas are often already less healthy and suffer from greater health inequalities. And in turn, then when they have an accident, that then compounds the existing, I suppose, ill health. And then what you have are then knock-on economic effects, which in turn then compound the economic disparities that we've talked about. So it becomes a vicious cycle.
What types of accidents are we having? Like, what are the most common? Like, do we still see, I don't know, spikes around a bank holiday because people, who are very amateur get their DIY kit out and, cut their thumb off? Like, where are the danger zones? What are we seeing in terms of the most prevalent accidents that people are having?
The most common serious accidents that people have are actually falls. That can be falling on stairs, that can be falling over on a pavement, can be falling from a ladder. There are lots of different ways in which people can fall over. They are the single largest cause of serious accidental injury and accidental death that we see. To some people, they might sound trivial when I say falls, but that's a really wide spectrum of injuries. And actually, even falls that might seem relatively innocuous, tripping over on a step, can cause very serious injury if then you compound that with, for instance, head injury or a broken hip. Unfortunately, that's where we tend to see the most serious accidents happen. But you're absolutely right in pointing out, actually, with your DIY analogy, that accidents most often happen in the home. And this is the other quite striking thing that's come out of this
I did
report.
want to ask you about that, because workplace accidents used to be very much the main focus of attention. But it really looks like we're seeing that now it's all about non-work accidents. Does this kind of mean that previously dangerous jobs like construction are now quite safe because industry, regardless of whether it was a government diktat or not, has kind of got its act together in terms of protecting people in the workplace?
Certainly, industry has improved. I wouldn't want to say that it's totally safe or anything along those lines. And certainly, actually, your example of construction, well, construction, unfortunately, still has I think the highest rate of unintentional deaths and injuries out of all of the sectors of the economy in work. But you're right in pointing out, certainly, that whilst there might still be things that we can still do and that employers need to do and workers need to do to improve safety at work, particularly in higher risk occupations and sectors of the economy. Actually, when we think about where the bulk of serious accidents happen, they happen outside of work. To put this into perspective, there were, I think, about 135 work-related deaths in 2022 to 23. And, well, you've already outlined 21,000 people were killed due to unintentional injuries in wider society. So really, over 90, what must that be, 98, 99% of accidental deaths happen outside of work.
Can I just ask you a quick question on that? Because of the year that you chose being a year straight after the pandemic, when we
Yes.
did see a huge shift away from work-based work to home working.
Yes.
So does that data, when you say a work-based accident, mean that they could have been hurting themselves at home but during the working day? What I'm trying to get at is, are we inevitably going to have more accidents at home because we're now spending more time at home? Or does the data disaggregate, oh, no, you hurt yourself while leaning over your laptop at work and therefore that's a workplace injury?
No, I understand what you mean. Well, to put it into context, in the year before the pandemic, so 2018 to 19, the last full year we have reporting, there were 149 work-related deaths according to the system that we record those on. And actually, if we look back at the number of deaths that took place at home and elsewhere across the wider economy in that year, frankly, it was, as I say, we have seen year-on-year increases. But if we look back at 2019, we're on about 18,000 accidental deaths across all of society. So actually what we've seen is, if anything, workplace deaths have tended to hover around that 150 mark for quite a number of years now. Progress has slowed down, and I think that's partly because of the fact that we're at a stage where things are so much safer, it becomes harder to do that last bit. But we're still seeing a very high level of accidents at home. Yes, that has increased, but it was already increasing before the pandemic, and it has continued to increase subsequently. So I wouldn't really attribute that change to the pandemic itself.
Behind the bright lights and adrenaline of pro sports is an equally exciting world of negotiations and deal making.
That's what we cover each week on our podcast, The Deal.
I'm Alex Rodriguez, former baseball player turned business executive.
And I'm Jason Kelly, chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. Over the next couple months, we'll hear from all-stars like Jay Williams.
I want to be an owner one day.
Billie Jean King.
Learn the business.
And so many more. Listen to The Deal on Spotify.
I want to get back to your ask of government. You sort of outlined earlier that obviously there is an impact on the NHS, and so therefore we have, a Department of Health that might be concerned about this. We're talking about workplace incident and lost working days due to non-work related accidents. So therefore you've got a Department for Business and Trade aspect to this. Of course, Treasury, who are going to be keeping an eye on productivity, cost of public services, etc. There is no government department responsible for this. So what is your ask of government? Where would you like this strategy to sit?
Because of what you've outlined, and that is the fragmentation that I'm talking about. And by the way, there are so many other agencies and departments that have partial, overlapping sometimes responsibility for bits of accident prevention. We could spend a long time talking to them. But I think actually what we want is for a minister without portfolio to sit ideally within cabinet, and certainly with the ability to convene that cross-departmental accident prevention strategy that we're asking government for, because that would allow for somebody to recognize the disparate nature of the policy area, but also recognize that it's okay to have individual areas devolved to departments, but what it needs to have is an overarching strategy that makes sure that everywhere is moving in the same direction. Going back to the point around workplace injuries, the Department for Work and Pensions is responsible for the Health and Safety Executive, and they are the single sole regulator for health and safety in the workplace. It's okay that they have their own regulator, but what we need to make sure then is that we have both equivalent strength and clarity in other parts of government, like around housing, for instance, or product safety, but also then that on top of that, we have an overall strategy that sets a direction. And that's what we're asking for. And I think the best way to deliver that would ultimately be to be a minister without portfolio. In terms of where it also sits, I think there is a huge place for Treasury and for Cabinet Office here in understanding the implications of this. It could easily be pushed aside either as a very sort of policy area specific set of changes or as something that needs to sit in healthcare. And obviously it touches on all of those things. But ultimately, we need a central direction on this. And I think Treasury is both the best placed ultimately to deliver that impetus that we need because they feel the effect on the economy and on public spending, but also then because they can help to guide a direction. So a minister without portfolio who can set the strategy, supported, I think, by a strong sense of direction from Treasury in terms of wider spending remits.
Well, Rachel Reeves, Darren Jones, if you're listening to Quiet Riot, as I'm sure you absolutely certainly do, and you want to save some cash, then get behind this idea, push for the appointment of a cabinet member without portfolio to oversee all of this. I would like to ask you about the politics of it, James, because I am old enough to remember in 2011, there was this explosion of activity from right-leaning politicians like Chris Grayling, who were saying things like banning children from playing conkers was health and safety gone mad, and they whipped up a lot of, libertarian right voices behind them. Do you worry that in the culture war we all too often find ourselves in now, that your campaign is in danger of being labelled as, wokeism and interference in personal liberty? If I want to chop my own hand off at home, I should be allowed to do so. And if so, how are we going to combat that? How do we reframe the narrative to say that, health and safety is not a woke agenda? It is a perfectly valid and responsible thing for any modern government to be pursuing.
I think it's a very good question, Naomi. And I think aside from the economic argument we've already outlined, which hopefully would chime with people from across the political spectrum, there is also an emotional angle to this, frankly. We all have friends and loved ones, whether they're children, whether they're parents, grandparents, partners, or indeed close friends. And what our report shows is that all of them are at elevated risk of accidental injury or death. You mentioned at the beginning there might be some people listening that have never had to experience that, and that's lucky for them. But what our report shows is that unfortunately every year a lot of people do experience the consequences of these accidents, and this isn't something that is some unknown. It isn't something that's some evil or indescribable abstract set of concepts. This is actually something that has very tangible impacts on all of our lives. The idea that accidents are totally preventable, and they are, serious accidents are preventable, and we've seen that in the past through various interventions that have been developed, from the seatbelt in cars through to, as you mentioned, great stricter workplace health and safety, we can reduce the burden of these accidents. We can go from having 6,000 people die on our roads, as they did in the 1960s and 70s, down to 1,600 that died last year. Still too many, but a far greater improvement. And it's because of the changes that we've made. But I think there's another piece around this here, and it's not just the impact it has on people up and down the country, which is enormous. And as I've said, an impact that affects people, often people who are most excluded from society, very sadly as well. But there is also a point here that a lot of what we're calling for in our report and what we want government to do, it's not about taking away personal freedom. It's not about telling people not to do things. It is essentially about finding ways of making simple, everyday changes to just the ordinary processes we do. It's not about telling people not to do things, but it's about actually flagging that there are things you can do which dramatically reduce the risk of serious accidental injury and the consequences that come with that. And when we combine that change with an infrastructure that government could then build, whether that's regulatory or whether it is physical, like our roads, like new housing, that is safer by design.
So you mentioned roads, and I'm glad you did, because when I hear the word accident, and I suspect many people do, I think my brain immediately goes to road traffic accident. Have things like the widespread introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones and increasingly automated vehicles that beep at you, if you get too close to something or cross the line in the motorway or whatever, has that begun to reduce the devastation of road-related injury?
There is very strong evidence from across the world that 20 mile per hour limits and slower speed limits generally have a really positive impact in terms of they reduce serious injuries and they reduce the number of people being killed in areas where those limits are imposed. The exact implementation of that means that you end up with slight disparities and differences between areas, and there are different ways of doing it and ways of improving it and tinkering with it. But certainly at RoSPA, the evidence we've seen before us is pretty unequivocal. That improves things. In terms of autonomous vehicles, it's still quite early days in terms of understanding how they can improve safety. There's, I think, a bit of a debate to be had around driverless cars and things like that, and semi-automated vehicles around how safe they are. And it's probably better that I didn't try and come down either side of that today. But certainly when it comes to reducing speed limits, it's one of the best ways to ultimately save lives on our roads.
And finally, you mentioned it very briefly earlier. You said the word seatbelt, and that triggered me on it. Do we need more public service announcements? Those seem to have more or less disappeared, with the exception of like tiredness kills dot matrix screens on the motorways. And I'm definitely old enough to remember the old clunk click seatbelt awareness ads on TV as a child that sort of horrified me, and the crash test dummy, sort of being beheaded when somebody had to brake even at 30 miles an hour. Do you want government to be running similar campaigns again?
We do. We think there's a real place for government to be informing the public about ways that they can live their lives more safely. Seatbelts are one example where there is obviously also a legal requirement, but there are lots of other ways. We can very simply look around our own homes, and I could probably point out a dozen hazards in my own home and in anybody's that I would go into that are very easy to fix. It's not about breaking the law or implementing requirements, but it's about saying to people, you've got to be careful here because you could trip and fall over that, or your child could get injured doing this. To give an example from our report, we have a case study of a woman that was staying at her daughter's house over Christmas, and her young grandchildren had left a bunch of toys on the stairs. It was nighttime, and the woman who ultimately got injured came out to get a glass of water from her room. The lights were off. She didn't want to wake up the children, so she didn't put the lights on. As she went to walk down the stairs, she tripped on one of their toys. And firstly, she then fell. But because the stairs was one of those, I gather one of the ones from the 60s or 70s, it didn't have banisters, which seems crazy today, doesn't it? It was very fashionable in those days. And she fell straight from the stairs onto the floor. She broke her foot. She obviously had to be off work for a long time. There's a sequence of things that happened there, right? And it's not to put blame on anybody, but it's to say, even when it's Christmas and people are probably, it's been a long day and people have had to be looking after the kids and looking after
Might have had a
family
bit to drink.
Might have had a little bit to drink. Yeah, whether her or whether the parents, that ultimately, kids' toys shouldn't be left on stairs. Nothing should be left on stairs like that. And actually, that is itself just a really simple piece of advice. It might seem obvious to a lot of people, but every year there are hundreds, probably thousands of people that are really seriously injured in those sorts of accidents that are entirely preventable. But it's not just in that case about tripping on some toys and falling downstairs. That's a behavioral change. There's also then a bit about the fact that people are living in houses where there's no handrails or banisters on stairs. And if you've got young children, as they obviously did, that in itself is particularly dangerous. So there's a bit around how do we create awareness around everyday hazards, right? And some of that can be really key stuff, like you said, seatbelts. I'd love to see more around dangerous driving on the roads and things like that as well, drink driving and drug driving, but also everyday things in the home. Stuff like that, which I think ordinarily we might just assume people do, or because it's in the home, we feel like we shouldn't be saying anything about. But there's such a strong public interest, I think, given the economic costs of this, not to mention the human ones, that actually raising people's awareness, just reminding them that there are little things they can do that take away those kinds of hazards. Because we see at RoSPA all the time numerous different cases of frankly, entirely preventable accidents that do happen. And some of them happen because of policy decisions and infrastructure problems and designed in issues like the lack of a handrail in the house. And some of it happen because ultimately of behavioral change and behavioral issues and perhaps a lack of awareness of risk. So, we've done stuff around housing as well, where we've looked at things like carbon monoxide monitors. And we know that there are a lot of people out there that now know about the risks of carbon monoxide. I think, again, used to be TV adverts around that. There's an awful lot of people who have still admitted, even as landlords, that they don't put carbon monoxide monitors in their properties and they don't test them. People, their tenants, should be aware of those risks. Exactly, it's disgraceful. So there's a lot more we could be doing around raising awareness in a way that, again, to go back to your question around wokeism, that's not about telling people what they can and can't do. It's not an identity question. It is not about pitting people against each other. It's just very simple, pragmatic advice that can save lives.
Well, that's it for today. James, thank you so much for coming on Quiet Riot.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for having me. It's been great to talk to you about it today.
Listeners, you heard it here first. Put the toolbox down, get a professional in, and whatever you do, don't stick a knife in the toaster ever again. But most importantly, do tell your MP about the National Accident Prevention Strategy. We'll leave a link to the document in the show notes. Vital issue, one that it would be almost impossible for your MP to disagree with you on. So get in touch with them, send it over. And thank you for tuning in. Make sure to support us on Ko-Fi if you're not already, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you again soon. Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita. Artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.